September 17th, 1876. Helena, Montana Territory. 6:14 in the morning. The first snow of the season had come down overnight, not the killing kind, just a dusting that settled on the Elkhorn Mountains like a warning, written in a language everyone in Montana learned to read before their second winter. Astrid Voss stood in the dirt outside the cabin door with two flour sacks at her feet, a splitting maul in her right hand, and $7 in coins distributed between her coat pocket and the inside of her left boot. The weight of the coins in her pocket was negligible. The weight of them in her thinking was something else entirely. Niels Voss had given her until sundown. He had delivered the information the same way he delivered everything standing just inside the doorframe, so she remained on the step, so the geometry of the conversation was never in question. His voice carried the careful neutrality of a man who had rehearsed what he intended to say and stripped out anything that might invite argument. He told her the property had transferred legally. He told her he had no obligation beyond today. He told her the church basement was taking in single women through the Lutheran congregation if she needed direction finding somewhere to go. He used the word direction, not help. Direction as though she were a compass needle that had simply lost its north. Astrid had not said anything. She had looked at him for a long moment, at the soft line of his jaw, at the way he stood with his weight shifted to his back heel, the posture of a man who expected to be challenged and had already decided how to respond. She had picked up the flour sacks and walked down the step without a word spoken, because the only thing worse than giving Niels Voss what he wanted was giving him what he expected. She had not gone toward Helena. The town sat a quarter-mile north, at its main street already beginning to show the tentative morning movement of men heading toward the mining offices and women toward the dry goods. There were people in Helena who would speak to her, who would offer a meal and a seat by their fire, who would listen with genuine sympathy to the situation of Gunnar Voss's widow, turned out 3 weeks after the burial. She knew this. She had no interest in it. Sympathy was a warm room that cost you something on the way out, and she had already calculated what she could afford to spend. She walked south instead, following Prickly Pear Creek away from town, and she walked the way her father had taught her to walk through unfamiliar terrain slowly, with her eyes moving in a pattern that started close and swept outward, reading the ground before she trusted it with her weight. The creek ran low at this time of year, its banks still soft from the last autumn rains, the cottonwoods along the water yellowing at the edges and dropping leaves in slow, irregular pulses. She watched where the leaves accumulated. Where they piled deep against the banks meant slack water and soft ground. Where they barely caught before moving on meant current even in the shallows, which meant the bank was packed and the ground above it stable. Her father had been a charcoal burner in Dalarna, in a forest that covered the Swedish countryside the way darkness covers a room when you close the shutters completely without apology. He had died when she was 23, not from any dramatic cause, but from the accumulated arithmetic of hard winters and harder work, and she had crossed the Atlantic 4 years later with a gunner, and the specific understanding that the New World would not be easier, only different. 17 years in Montana had confirmed half of that equation. The difference was real. The ease had never materialized. What the crossing had not changed was the knowledge in her hands. Her father had taught her to read a forest the way some men read ledgers, not for sentiment, but for information. Which trees held their ground in wet soil and which ones didn't. How wood behaved at the cellular level when it bent versus when it broke. How a curve forced into living timber became permanent if you worked with the grain instead of against it. That knowledge had no cash value and no social currency and no standing before any court or council in Helena, Montana Territory. It was the only inheritance she had carried off the boat, and it was the only thing Niels Voss could not reach with a piece of paper in a dying man's guided hand. She stopped walking when the canyon narrowed. The south-facing slope here dropped away steeply to the creek, but the north-facing slope, the one she was standing on, rose at an angle steep enough that snow would not accumulate directly below it. It would pile on the ridge above and slide following gravity past the midpoint and out over the canyon bottom. She had been watching the terrain for 10 minutes, and she had found what she was looking for before she consciously identified she was looking for it. A natural alcove where an old rock slide had carved a semicircular recess into the hillside, roughly 11 feet across the opening, 6 feet deep where it met the rock face. The exposed stone curved inward like the interior of a barrel, which meant load would distribute laterally across the arch rather than concentrating at any single point. She drove the butt of the maul handle into the ground at the alcove's right edge. The resistance told her what she needed to know. The top 4 inches were frozen from last night's temperature drop, but below that the soil gave packed, not rocky, still workable. She marked the resistance point in her memory the way she marked everything, not with notes, because notes required materials, but with specificity. The soil would remain drivable for another 10 to 14 days if the temperature held above single digits at night. If it dropped harder and faster than the almanac predicted, she would lose the window entirely, and the whole calculation would have to change. She did not let herself consider what changing the whole calculation would mean. Not yet. The problem was not shelter. She could excavate a dugout into the hillside 20 feet east of this spot in 2 days if the ground cooperated, a simple horizontal cut of timber frame for the entrance, a sod roof built up from the spoil. She had seen it done by people with less experience than she had. The problem that actually threatened her life, the problem that had occupied the back of her thinking since she watched Niels Voss turn and walk back into the cabin that now belonged to him, was firewood. A Montana winter required 4 full cords of split-seasoned wood for a single person in a 12 by 12 space. That was not a generous estimate or a comfortable one. It was the arithmetic floor below which people died. 4 cords meant wood that burned clean rather than smoldering wood, that produced heat without filling a closed space with carbon monoxide while you slept. She had watched what the alternative looked like. In the autumn of 1874, a Norwegian homesteading family named Brenvik had burned wet, smoke-heavy pine in their dugout during a 3-day blizzard when they couldn't get out to replenish their stock. The eldest son had found them when the storm lifted. She had been at the burial. She had stood in the frozen ground and felt the knowledge of that outcome settle permanently into the way she thought about wood storage. The conventional solution was a separate woodshed, an 8 by 12 structure with milled lumber walls, a tin roof, and a raised floor to keep the bottom row of splits off the ground and away from moisture wicking. Materials alone ran between $30 and $40 in 1876 Helena pricing, and that assumed you had the physical capacity to build it or the money to hire someone who did. She had $7. She had 47 days before the first killing freeze, if the almanac held, and the weather did not accelerate ahead of it. She had a splitting maul, 2 flour sacks, and the accumulated knowledge of a Dalarna forest she had not walked in 21 years. She looked at the alcove for a long time. The rock face curved like the inside of a barrel. The hillside above would deflect snow and rain. The elevation kept it above the flood line that turned Prickly Pear Creek into a brown torrent every April. What she needed was a way to close the front without spending money she did not have, without using materials that required purchasing or tools that required returning. What she needed was something that grew along the creek bottom in abundance, that was supple enough to bend without breaking, and that if she worked it correctly would stiffen into a permanent shape once the living wood adjusted to the form she imposed on it. She was already walking toward the cottonwoods before she finished the thought. The creek bottom grew thick with young growth cottonwood and willow in tangles, so dense you had to turn sideways to move through them. In some places, nothing taller than 12 feet, nothing thicker than 4 inches in diameter. Green wood, pliable, exactly what she needed. She located the willow stand first because willow had more lateral flex than cottonwood, and she needed the arches to absorb lateral pressure without splintering at the bend point. She selected by feel as much as by eye, gripping each candidate sapling at the midpoint and applying force feeling for the resistance that indicated density without brittleness. She needed 12 each, approximately 14 feet long, each thick as her wrist. She cut them with the buck saw she had borrowed from Marcus Greer at the lumber company staging area, negotiating the loan with the promise of return before sunset and the implicit understanding that she would not make a habit of asking. Marcus Greer was a practical man who lent tools to people he judged would return them in the condition received. She had been in Helena long enough that he gave her the saw without additional conversation, which she took as its own kind of currency. The cutting took an hour and a half. The hauling took another 40 minutes. 12 14-foot saplings dragged singly through creek bottom brush and up the slope to the alcove by a woman who had slept the previous 2 nights under a canvas tarp stretched between pine trees while the temperature dropped to 28 degrees. She did not haul them all at once because hauling them all at once would have taken 3 times as long and left her too exhausted to do the next part of the work, and the next part of the work was what actually mattered. She drove 2 anchor stakes into the ground at the alcove's opening, one at each edge exactly 11 feet apart. She seated them 18 inches deep, compacting the soil around each with the butt of the maul until they had no give in any direction. Then she took the first sapling, buried the base in 18 inches deep on the left side, approximately 6 inches inside the left anchor stake, and began the bend. The wood resisted. It always did at first. There was a zone in any green sapling where the fiber alignment meant the wood was trying to return to vertical, and you could feel that tension in your palms and up through your wrists like a conversation you were having with something that had its own opinion about how things should go. Her father had described it as the wood telling you what it was, what it could do, and what it could not. The job was to listen without letting it win, to find the arc that the wood could accept, rather than the arc you wanted to impose, and to hold it in that position until the cellular memory adjusted. She had known this at 12 years old in a Swedish forest, bending saplings for temporary fencing around a charcoal kiln. The knowledge had not aged. She held the first sapling bent at the apex of its arc for 9 minutes by her internal count, then drove the opposite end into the ground on the right side of the alcove, anchoring it to match the depth on the left. The sapling formed a perfect semicircle, not a semicircle imposed by force, but one that the wood had accepted the arc. You could feel it settle into when you found the right curve. She moved to the second sapling, then the third. She spaced each arch 16 inches from the previous one, working from the face of the alcove back toward the rock. By the time she had driven the sixth arch, the framework had started to look like something the rib cage of a structure, half buried in the hillside, the entrance to a tunnel built from living wood. The arches held their curves without the anchor stakes once she reached the midpoint because the tension in each one was counterbalancing the adjacent ones, a structural conversation she was engineering rather than accidentally discovering. She understood why it worked. The arch was the most efficient shape in nature for distributing vertical load because it converted downward pressure into outward thrust along the curve. And if the curve was continuous and the material was consistent, the load spread across the entire arc rather than concentrating where it would fail. Cal Merritt arrived mid-afternoon. She had seen him at the lumber staging area that morning, a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with the unhurried walk of someone who had learned that urgency on difficult terrain was how people got hurt. He had been foreman on the Northern Pacific survey crew before taking a mining claim outside Marysville, and his reputation in Helena was for bluntness, without cruelty, which made him better than most and worse than some. He stood at the edge of the alcove and looked at the 6 completed arches and the 6 saplings she had not yet bent. His expression was the expression of a man performing a structural calculation in his head and not arriving at a number he liked. "Mrs. Voss," he removed his hat. "Interesting notion you're building." Her hands did not stop moving. "A woodshed." "A woodshed." He studied the framework, the arches without walls, without roof, without floor. "Not yet it isn't." "Not yet," she said, which was not agreement or disagreement, but simply an acknowledgement that he had identified the current state of a project that was not finished. Cal's chest shifted with a slow breath. "Ma'am, I don't mean to overstep, but you've got 6 weeks before snow that'll bury this canyon. Cottonwood and willow won't hold a snow load. The first serious storm will flatten whatever you're building here. She straightened from the arch she had just seated and looked at him directly for the first time. Snow is going to hit the hillside 20 feet above this spot and slide right over. I'm not building tall enough to catch it. He looked at the slope above the alcove. She watched him do the trigonometry in his head, the angle of the hillside, the likely trajectory of sliding snow, the height of the completed structure relative to the slope's midpoint. He did not immediately find a counterargument, which meant he was at least considering the geometry rather than dismissing it. But he did not look convinced. What about the walls? His boot moved the dirt near the base of an anchor stake. Woven saplings won't hold wind, won't hold moisture. Come January, you'll have gaps wide enough to thread a hand through. I'm aware of the gaps, she said. The woven lattice was not the final surface, it was the substrate for what came after. But she did not explain that. Not because she owed him nothing, which was technically true, but because explaining the whole plan to a man who had not asked for her opinion on any subject meant defending the project before it existed, which was work she preferred to spend on the project itself. Cal put his hat back on. He looked at the remaining saplings. He looked at the rock face of the alcove and the curve of the stone. She could see something shift in his assessment, not toward belief it's kindly, but toward a more complicated uncertainty. He had come here expecting to find what he had expected to find, and the thing he was looking at was not what he had expected. And Cal was the kind of man who did not know what to do with the gap between expectation and reality, except to wait and see which one proved out. He walked away without another word. She watched him stop 50 yards downstream and remain there, his back turned, ostensibly interested in the lumber staging operation, but she noticed that he positioned himself at an angle that would allow him to observe her work in his peripheral vision without appearing to watch. She filed this away. Cal changed his mind based on evidence. Not on argument, not on explanation, not on reassurance. On evidence. She would need to remember that. The light was failing by the time she seated the 12th arch. She stood back and looked at the completed framework from the distance of 15 feet, and the structure revealed itself whole for the first time. 12 arches of living willow, curving from the ground at the alcove's face back to the rock, the ribs of something that looked less like a construction project and more like the skeleton of an animal pressed into the hillside. The lines were clean, the spacing was consistent. The curve of each arch matched the adjacent ones within a margin that would have satisfied a much better equipped builder. There was a moment, brief, unannounced, not something she had planned or would have admitted if asked, when she understood that it was beautiful. Not the beauty of decoration or display, the beauty of a solution that fit his problem exactly the way a well-made joint fits the wood. It joins the way a properly sharpened edge separates material along the grain without resistance. She had built things before. She had never built something that looked this much like itself on the first day. She returned the buck saw to Marcus Greer with 17 minutes to spare before sundown. She ate that night from one of the flour sacks, hardtack, and dried venison she had packed before leaving the cabin that morning. Enough calories to maintain work capacity, but not enough to be comfortable. She sat against the pine tree that served as one anchor point for her canvas tarp and listened to the creek and the coyotes and the periodic sound of horse on the Helena Road above her. The temperature dropped to 24 degrees by midnight. She had one blanket in the canvas tarp and the wool of her coat, and she arranged all three with the efficiency of someone who had slept rough before and knew that the difference between adequate and inadequate insulation was not the total amount of material, but the management of air gaps. She lay looking up at the canvas for a long time before she slept. The second day brought frost that killed the last of the summer wildflowers along the creek bank, a hard, definitive frost that turned the remaining yellow petals to brown overnight and left the meadow grasses crunched and white in the early light. She was already at the creek before the sun cleared the elkhorn ridge, cutting the willow shoots she had selected the previous afternoon. Long, slender ones, 6 to 8 feet, no thicker than her thumb, the most flexible growth from the bases of established willows that had sent up new shoots after being grazed back over the summer. She cut them by the armload and carried them to the alcove and began the weaving. The principle was basket making. It was exactly basket making expanded to architectural scale, each horizontal shoot woven over and under the vertical arches in an alternating pattern pulled tight before the next shoot was introduced, building up a lattice that would distribute pressure across the entire surface rather than concentrating at any individual point. She had not made a basket in 20 years. Her hands remembered the tension anyway. The work bled her by the fourth hour. Willow shoots had edges like thin paper, not sharp enough to cut deeply with a single pass, but sharp enough to open the skin of a palm that gripped and gripped again over thousands of repetitions. She tied strips of burlap from her flour sack around each hand at the palm and continued. The burlap darkened and she rewrapped and continued again. By mid-afternoon, the south wall of the alcove opening had risen to 4 feet, and from any distance greater than 20 yards, the structure no longer looked like an unfinished frame. It looked like something that had a plan. James Whitfield found her at that hour. She had seen him earlier in the day at the edge of the lumber staging area talking to one of Greer's men, the particular settled posture of someone who was not transacting business, but passing time while waiting for something else. He was somewhere in his early 50s, built like a man who had spent decades doing work that required both strength and precision, with the kind of weathered face that made it impossible to read surprise on, not because he felt none, but because his expressions moved slowly like water, finding its level. He had come from Appalachia. Originally, she had heard, and had worked his way west through California and Nevada before the Montana silver draws brought him north. He stood at the edge of the alcove and looked at the woven wall and the arched framework and the rock face behind it, and his expression was not the expression of a man calculating whether the structure would fail. It was the expression of a man who had seen something like this before. "I tried to build at this spot," he said, 2 winters ago. Astrid stopped weaving. What happened? He had used pine saplings, not the thin, flexible willow she was using, but young lodgepole pine, 3 to 4 inches in diameter, which had seemed like a structural advantage until the temperature dropped to 15 below and the wood contracted. He had not accounted for the degree of contraction in material that thick. The differential between the contraction at the surface of each pole and the contraction at the core created internal stress, and when the stress exceeded the cohesive strength of the wood fiber, the poles split not all at once but in sequence through one night, a series of sounds he had described to the man he was building it for as the structure finding what it couldn't hold. By morning, the framework had bowed outward, and 2 days later, it collapsed entirely. Astrid said, "You used timber instead of withies." "I used what I thought would hold weight." Smaller material holds more weight when it bends. Bending converts load to tension across the length instead of compression at the point. The thinner the member, the more it can deflect before it fails. She said this the way she stated most things without any particular investment in whether it was accepted simply as information that was accurate and therefore worth stating. Willow at this diameter contracts less than an inch per 12 feet in Montana cold. The differential is manageable. Whitfield was quiet for a moment. He looked at the alcove wall, and then at the frame, and then at the pile of shoots she had not yet used. His chest shifted with a slow exhale. "You need someone to hold while you drive." He shrugged off his coat and rolled his sleeves to the elbow in a single motion, the motion of a man who had already decided before he asked the question. It was not charity, she understood that. It was the specific recognition from one person who worked with materials to another that a certain phase of a construction project required a second pair of hands, regardless of how competent the first pair was. She accepted without ceremony, and they worked through the remainder of the afternoon in the functional near silence of 2 people who had each discovered the other was worth working alongside. Before he left, Whitfield set down a tin bucket at the base of the left anchor stake without comment. She looked inside rendered horse fat, half a bucket, the pale waxy consistency of properly processed tallow. She had been calculating whether she could trade for this and had not yet solved the problem of what she had to trade. Waterproofing for the bark when you get to the roof, he said, fills the gaps without adding weight. She looked at the bucket and then at him. In another context, she might have said something that acknowledged the gesture with appropriate weight. She said, I will account for it, which meant she would remember it and apply it when the time came to account for things. He seemed to understand that was what it meant. She spent the third and fourth days completing the woven walls, working from the base of the opening on both sides and bringing the lattice upward in successive courses, each one woven tight enough to block wind, but open enough that moisture could not collect and pool. By the end of the fourth day, the wall was 7 feet high at the center arch, and the structure had acquired something she had not entirely anticipated, a solidity that was apparent not just structurally but visually, the kind of solidity that comes from density of material rather than thickness of individual members. Each willow shoot was thin, but there were hundreds of them, and their combined mass at the surface of the wall had real presence. Pastor Edmund Hale made his first direct appearance on the morning of the fifth day. He was a man in his mid-50s who moved through Helena with the particular authority of someone whose institutional role had calcified into personal identity, so long a minister that the church and the man had become indistinguishable, at least in his own accounting. He had emigrated from Bavaria in 1868 and had arrived in Montana with the theological conviction that the frontier required moral ordering, even more urgently than it required physical infrastructure, which was a reasonable position that he had over the subsequent 8 years applied, with a rigidity that made it unreasonable in practice. He came with a congregant named Peters, a quiet man who appeared to function primarily as an audience for Hale's pronouncements, and he stood at the distance appropriate for inspecting something he intended to have an opinion about. He did not look at the structure the way Cal had looked at it, with the analytical interest of a man calculating load ratios. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that troubles him, not because of what it is, but because of what it represents. Mrs. Voss. He removed his hat with the deliberate motion of a man performing courtesy rather than feeling it. The congregation has discussed your situation. We can offer you domestic work in exchange for accommodation in the church basement through the winter, standard arrangements, cleaning, laundering, meal preparation for church functions. She had been working the top course of the east wall when he arrived. She did not stop immediately. She finished the chute she was weaving in, pulled it tight, and then descended the improvised ladder she had built from pine branches. She wiped her hands on the work apron she had made from the second flour sack and looked at him directly the way she had looked at Nels Voss from the cabin step, with complete attention and no particular softness. How many hours each week, Pastor? 30, possibly 35 depending on need. And the room? 8 by 10, shared facilities, adequate heat. She looked at him for a moment that extended past the comfortable range of such interactions. I'm 41 years old, Pastor Hale. I've buried a husband and 2 children, and I have worked every day of my life since I was 7 years old. I'm not interested in becoming a servant in a church basement. The pink that rose in Hale's face was not embarrassment. It was the particular coloration of a man who had affected something and received something else and was recalculating. Pride is a sin, Mrs. Voss. The corner of her mouth moved not quite a smile. So is wasting what God gave you. He gave me 2 hands and a working mind. I'm using both. Hale's eyes moved to the structure behind her, the woven walls, the arched framework, being the half-completed form that was unmistakably neither a traditional building nor a natural formation, but something that occupied the territory between them. His expression carried something she recognized as theological discomfort, the look of a man who has constructed a framework for understanding the world and encountered something that does not fit inside it. This structure, he said, is inappropriate, unseemly. A Christian woman does not burrow into the earth like an animal. I'm building a woodshed, she said. My dugout is 20 feet east. The dugout did not yet exist. She had marked the location with a stick and intended to start excavation the following day. He did not need to know this. Hale straightened his coat with both hands, the gesture of a man recomposing himself. This will fail. When it does, the congregation's offer may no longer stand. She looked at the structure and then back at him, and what she felt in that moment was not anger. Anger required surprise as its substrate, and she was not surprised by any part of this conversation. What she felt was the clean, clarifying resolution of a person who has been told they cannot do something they have already decided to do. Then I'd better not fail, she said. He left. Peters followed without speaking, as Peters apparently always did. She watched them until they were past the lumber staging area and onto the Helena Road, and she watched the moment when Hale stopped and spoke to a man she had seen twice at the edge of the alcove, well-dressed for a working town, the kind of vest that indicated office work rather than physical labor. The conversation was brief. The man in the vest made a note in a small book. Hale moved on. She filed this away with the precision she applied to all observed information, a man who kept notes at Hale's direction watching her work. She did not know yet what this meant. She intended to find out. The roof took 2 days of climbing. She had identified the ponderosa stands on the ridge above the alcove on her first survey walk. Mature trees with a thick plate-like bark that ponderosas develop over decades. Bark that peeled away in sections 2 feet long and 14 inches wide, curved to match the radius of the trunk. She climbed 8 trees in the course of those 2 days, working from a foothold cut into the bark with a small chisel borrowed from Whitfield, peeling sections from the south-facing side of each trunk where the bark dried fastest and separated cleanest. 73 sections in total. She carried them down in armloads 20 at a time until her hands were black with pine pitch and her shoulders had developed a specific ache at the joint that she recognized as the early stage of a more serious problem she did not have time to develop. She lapped the bark sections over the arch framework like roof tiles, each piece overlapping the one below it by 4 inches, each piece secured at its upper edge by willow pins driven through pre-punched holes. She worked from the bottom of each arch upward, the way water runs downhill, so every joint shed water away from the structure rather than into it. The tallow wet field had left, mixed with pine pitch heated over a small fire, went into every seam worked in with her fingers until the junction between each bark section was sealed against any gap larger than a hairline. When she climbed down and stood back on the evening of the 7th day, the structure was complete. It measured 11 feet across the face, 6 feet deep to the rock, 7 feet high at the crown of the center arch. 66 square feet of interior space. The curved walls and roof formed a continuous, self-supporting dome that required no interior posts or beams because the arch distributed every load it received through the structure to the earth on both sides. At the top of the east and west walls, she had left narrow vent gaps 2 inches covered on the outside with a second layer of woven chutes, space to admit air, but not precipitation that would allow moisture to escape without creating a pathway for wind-driven rain or snow. She stood at the face of the alcove and looked at what she had built. It did not look like a woodshed. It looked like something that had been there longer than the creek, longer than the cottonwoods, longer than the mining road above, a form that had resolved itself out of the hillside rather than been imposed upon it. The bark tiles caught the low angle of the September evening light and gave the roof the texture of old wood grain. The clay-colored wattle walls receded into the color of the hillside soil in a way that made the boundaries between structure and landscape genuinely ambiguous. If you did not know what it was, you might not see it at first. You might look at the hillside and see only the hillside. She spent the next 3 days cutting and splitting lodgepole pine from the draws above the creek. She used the maul she had carried from the cabin and a borrowed splitting wedge from Whitfield's gear, working from first light until she lost the light to see by. The lodgepole grew dense in the upper draws, straight-grained and clean-burning if you let it season properly, and she had enough autumn left That woodcut now would have 6 to 8 weeks of air drying before the deep cold hit. She split each round into quarters, then eighths, then stacked them inside the arch structure in the pattern her father had taught her. Large logs along the bottom for a stable base. Smaller splits stacked above with the cut face outward to expose maximum surface area to the air. Everything angled 2 degrees inward, so any residual moisture in the wood wicked toward the center of the stack and out the bottom rather than toward the wall. By the evening of October 1st, the structure held 3.5 cords of split pine stacked floor to ceiling with 18 inches of working space at the entrance. The remaining half cord she needed would come from continued cutting over the next 2 weeks. The first real test arrived in the small hours of October 3rd. She heard it begin before she felt it, the sound of rain against the canvas of her sleeping tarp, which had been shifted and restaked 40 feet east where she had begun excavating the dugout. The rain intensified within 20 minutes to the driving horizontal kind that found the gap between a tarp and the ground and worked its way in from the edges. Temperature at 34 degrees, which was the worst possible combination, too warm for snow, to distribute the moisture evenly across the landscape cold enough that everything the rain touched retained it. Wind from the northwest at a sustained force she estimated at 35 miles per hour, with gusts above 40. She lay in the dugout still just an excavated hole with a timber lip and canvas overhead and listened to the sound of 36 hours of weather moving through Prickly Pear Canyon. Water ran off the hillside above in sheets. The creek rose. The cottonwoods along the bank thrashed in a way that sounded like distress rather than movement. She heard something heavy fall in the timber above her twice during the night branches, or small trees losing their grip on saturated soil. She did not check the woodshed in the dark. There was nothing useful she could do there, and moving through the canyon in 40-mile-per-hour wind with a lantern was a category of poor decisions she refused to make. She had built what she had built. It would either hold or it would not, and her watching it would not change which. The storm broke at mid-morning of October 5th. She pushed the canvas aside and stood in pale, exhausted autumn sunlight with the particular attention of a person about to receive information they had staked something significant on. The hillside above the alcove had shed 2 visible channels of water runoff. During the storm, she could see the scored tracks in the soil, and both channels had diverted around the structure exactly as the topography should have directed them, following the path of least resistance to either side of the alcove's natural shoulders. She walked to the woodshed. The bark roof was intact. Every seam was sealed. The wattle wall showed not a single leak point. She ran her hand along the interior surface from floor to arch and found clay that was still firm damp in the way that all earthen material is damp during heavy rain, but not saturated, not compromised. She moved to the wood stack and pulled a split from the center of the pile, a section she had cut and stacked 7 days ago, and turned it in her hands, feeling the weight pressing her thumbnail into the grain. Dry, not surface dry, not drying out, but genuinely consistently dry through the entire cross-section. The moisture content was exactly what she had put in. The structure had held it perfectly. She set the split down carefully on the stack. She had built it expecting this result. But expectations and evidence are not the same thing, and what she felt standing in the dry interior was not triumph. It was the specific satisfaction of a proof carried through to its conclusion. The problem had been real. The solution had been real. The result confirmed both. She did not notice the footprints until she was stepping back out through the burlap doorway. The mud at the entrance, freshened by 36 hours of rain, held the impression of boot soles clearly a size larger than her own. The tread pattern of a working boot rather than a dress shoe, the placement suggesting a person who had stood at the entrance and looked in rather than entering. The stance was deliberate, both feet planted, parallel weight distributed evenly, the body position of someone standing still and looking for an extended period. Not casual curiosity. Assessment. She studied the prints for a moment, and then looked up and outward at the creek bottom, the lumber staging area, the slope above. Nothing moved. Whoever had stood here in the rain and watched the interior of her woodshed had done so and left before the storm cleared. The mud had preserved the record of their presence, but not their identity. She filed the information with the other unresolved pieces, the man in the vest taking notes at Hale's direction. The assessment happening without her knowledge at night in weather that would have kept most people indoors. Someone who wanted to look at what she had built without being seen doing it and who had their own reasons for wanting to know whether it worked. She walked back to the dugout, picked up the maul, and went to cut more firewood. There were 37 days left before the first killing freeze if the weather held and the work was not finished. The boot prints dried out by the following afternoon and told her nothing new. She had looked at them once more in the morning light, confirmed what she already knew. Deliberate stance, extended observation departure before the storm cleared, and then made the decision that defined the rest of her approach to the problem. She would not try to identify the watcher through inquiry, which required social capital she did not have, but through construction, which required only continued work. If the interest was hostile, it would eventually announce itself in a form she could respond to. If it was merely curious, it would dissipate on its own. Either way, the answer was the same. Keep building. Give it nothing to find except a completed structure and a woman who had not been stopped by the attention. She placed a thin strip of birch bark across the bottom of the doorway that evening, balanced so that any disturbance would knock it loose and leave it flat on the ground. The kind of indicator a person set when they could not afford to post a watch. When she checked it 3 mornings running and found it undisturbed, she shifted her attention to the practical problem of the clay. The woven walls needed to be sealed, not painted or surfaced, but fundamentally sealed, every gap in the willow lattice filled with material that would resist both wind infiltration and moisture penetration without cracking when the temperature dropped below zero, and stayed there for weeks. She had told Whitfield she would use creek clay, and she had meant it, but clay alone cracked under the thermal cycling of a Montana winter, with a reliability that made it useless as an exterior finish. The ancient solution, the one her father had called Lärkvägen in the Swedish dialect of his home region, and the one that homesteaders across the American frontier had rediscovered independently through the unforgiving trial of bad winters, was to mix the clay with organic fiber before application. The fiber bridged developing cracks as the clay contracted. It converted a brittle matrix into a composite that flexed instead of failing. She needed 3 things: clay, dry grass, and manure. The clay deposit was upstream, 200 yards north of the alcove, visible where a freeze-thaw cycle had exposed a clean face in the bank, gray-blue creek clay, with enough mineral content to hold its shape when worked and enough plasticity to be mixed without becoming gluey. She tested it by pressing a thumb-sized lump between her palms, rolling it to a thin cylinder, and bending it double. It did not crack at the bend. It held the curve and recovered partially when released. Good clay. She cut it out with the hatchet she had borrowed from Greer's staging area and carried it in both flour sacks, trading off the weight between hands every 100 yards on the way back to the alcove. Dry grass she collected from the meadow above the creek, the late-season stems that had cured on the stalk through September, still holding their fiber integrity without being brittle enough to powder when mixed. She cut armloads of it with her belt knife and bundled it loosely against immediate use, keeping it away from the creek bank where morning dew would re-wet it. The manure came from the livery stable at the edge of Helena's main commercial district, operated by a man named Grover Cole, who ran a tight, well-maintained operation and had the pragmatic outlook of someone whose entire professional life revolved around the relationship between animals and the materials they produced. She explained what she needed and why. Cole looked at her and then at the 2 empty flour sacks she was carrying, and then at her again with the expression of a man applying a test he applied to everyone. His chest settled with the slow decision of someone choosing practical over skeptical. Take what you can carry. I've got more than I'll ever use before spring. She mixed the 3 materials in a shallow depression, She excavated beside the alcove roughly 2 parts clay to 1 part chopped grass, fiber to 1 part manure, combined with just enough water to achieve a consistency she described to herself as thick porridge. The ratios were not precise. They never were in field applications. You learn the material's behavior by feel, by the way it moved off the mixing stick, by the way it cohered when you pressed a handful against the wall and held it for 3 seconds. Too wet, and it would shrink excessively during drying. Too dry, and it would not bond to the willow lattice. The right consistency left a clean impression of your palm and held a vertical surface without slumping. She packed the mixture into the lattice gaps from the outside, first working from the base of each wall, upward, pressing the clay composite into every opening with her fingers, and then smoothing the surface to encourage drainage rather than pooling. 1.5 inches on the exterior. Then she went inside and packed from the interior another 1.5 inches until the wall was a full 3 inches thick at every point. The clay surface she left on the interior was smoother finished with a damp rag to close surface pores. The exterior surface she left with a slight texture, not rough enough to catch debris, but not polished enough to hold water and surface tension against the wall face. The work consumed 4 days and left her shoulders in a state she recognized as the warning stage before injury. She had learned to recognize that stage years ago and to respond to it not by stopping. Stopping was not available, but by changing the mechanics of the movement. She switched from overhead reaching to low reaching on alternating half days, which redistributed the load across different muscle groups and bought enough recovery time in each one to continue. James Whitfield appeared on the second day of daubing with a question that had nothing sentimental about it. He looked at the clay composite she was mixing and picked up a handful and worked it between his fingers with the assessment of a man who had handled similar materials under different names in different parts of the country. This will crack at the joins where the willow moves differently from the clay. He was not predicting failure. He was identifying a specific failure mode that was distinct from the general cracking she had already addressed. She knew about the join problem. The willow shoots are still green. They'll continue moving for another 6 weeks as they dry. I'm building the clay layers thin enough that when the wood settles, the composite will flex with it rather than separate from it. After the wood reaches its final dimension, I'll add a finishing coat over any cracks that develop. Whitfield considered this for a moment. His jaw moved slightly in the way of a man running through the sequence in his head and finding it coherent. He picked up the mixing stick and began to stir without being asked. They worked through the afternoon without speaking much because the work was the communication that mattered. By the end of the 4th day of daubing, the walls had transformed. What had been an open lattice of woven willow had become a continuous surface, gray-brown textured solid to the eye and to the hand. She tapped the exterior with her knuckle and got the sound she wanted, not the hollow resonance of a thin covering over empty space, but the flat knock of material that went all the way through. She pressed both palms flat against the surface and held them there, feeling for temperature differential. The clay was cold on the outside. Inside the structure behind 3 inches of composite wall, the temperature against her palms was immeasurably warmer. Not dramatically, not enough to be remarkable in comfortable weather, but enough that she understood what it would mean in January, when the differential between outside and inside was the difference between function and freezing. The first significant cold arrived on October 9th, not the final freeze, but the kind of hard overnight drop that turned the remaining puddles from the October 3rd rain into opaque white discs by morning. She checked the woodshed at dawn. The clay walls had dried considerably over the preceding days in the thin autumn sunshine, and the thermal contraction of the clay surface had produced exactly the kind of shallow surface cracking she had anticipated at the joins between the composite and the willow frame. None of the cracks penetrated the full wall thickness. She worked a finishing coat of finer clay screened through the burlap of a flour sack to remove grit into every surface crack that afternoon, smoothing it flush and leaving the surface sealed. This was when Cal Merritt came back, and this time he brought someone with him. Wade Oakes had been working the Marysville district for 8 months, running a small two-man silver operation in a draw above the main mining camp. He was a compact, quietly methodical man in his mid-40s who gave the impression of someone who had learned through experience to assess situations rather than react to them. He looked at the completed woodshed for a long time without speaking, walking the perimeter, crouching to look at the base of the walls where the clay composite met the ground, standing back to look at the roof profile. Cal Merritt's posture carried the specific quality of a man who had made a decision he was not going to announce or explain. He had watched the structure survive two significant weather events. He had returned to look at it both times without announcing that was what he was doing. He had now brought a man with a practical need. Oak straightened from his examination of the base wall. "I need to get my equipment through the winter. Drill heads, a pump assembly, hand tools. It's not a cash expense I can absorb if they rust through." He looked at Astrid directly. "What would it take to build something like this over my equipment cache at the Marysville site?" She walked him through the material requirements. In the site conditions, he would need the natural alcove or an excavated analog, the willow or equivalent flexible material available near the site, the clay deposit access. She told him it could be done in 8 to 10 days of sustained work by two people less if the site had natural advantages similar to this one. His hands settled on his coat lapels in the way of a man about to name something. "I don't have cash to pay for the work right now. The assay results are due in 6 weeks, and if the vein runs the direction we think, that changes. But right now, Simon," he paused with the particular honesty of someone who had decided not to dress the situation differently than it was. "Right now, I have a 5% stake in the claim I could transfer against the work. It's probably worth nothing. It might be worth something. I can't tell you which." Astrid looked at him for a moment. A stake in a Marysville silver claim that might be worth nothing was mathematically exactly what it sounded like: a contingent asset with uncertain value and no immediate purchasing power. She had $7 and change remaining from her original stake. She had food enough through October if she was careful. She had no income and no immediate prospect of one. She said yes because Oakes had been honest about the uncertainty when he could have obscured it, and because work was available and she had the capacity to do it, and because a contingent asset was still an asset, and nothing she had walked away from Niels Voss's cabin with came with better odds than uncertain. They would go to the Marysville site after the 1st of November when her own winter preparations were complete. The week that followed brought 7 different people to the alcove to look at what she had built. 3 came from direct referrals. Whitfield had mentioned her work to men at the mining camp mess who had their own storage problems. 2 came because they had seen the structure from the lumber staging area, and their curiosity had finally outweighed their caution. 1 came because Cal Merritt had said 4 words to a homesteader he encountered on the Helena Road: "Go look at Voss's woodshed." 1 came for reasons she never determined. She showed each of them what she had done and explained the principles in terms of materials and geometry rather than theory. She did not charge for the information. She asked each person who had extra food or materials to share what they could and leave what they could not. By the end of the week, she had 3 pounds of dried beans, a half pound of salt pork, 2 handfuls of dried apple rings from someone's summer preservation, and a wool blanket that a mining engineer named Forsyth gave her without explanation, saying only that it had belonged to his mother and he had been carrying it for 2 years without using it. She accepted all of it without ceremony, because ceremony around necessary things was a luxury that served the giver more than the receiver, and she was the receiver. It was during this same week that she had her second encounter with Pastor Hale, and this time it was not a pastoral call. She learned the shape of it first from Whitfield, who had a broad acquaintance in Helena that extended across social lines in the way that longtime residents of small communities often did. He knew the mining men and the merchantmen and the churchmen, not because he sought their company, but because in a town of Helena's size, sustained presence created familiarity, whether you arranged it or not. He came to the alcove on the 15th of October with the expression of a man carrying information he had decided she needed to have. Pastor Hale had submitted a written petition to the Helena Town Council requesting that the council address what the petition called unauthorized structures on public land along Prickly Pear Creek, constituting both a hazard and an affront to the orderly development of the district. The petition named no individuals. It did not need to. There was one structure on public land along Prickly Pear Creek that had been constructed in the preceding 30 days, and its builder was known to everyone in town who paid attention to anything. The man in the vest, whom Whitfield identified as Marcus Webb, the town council secretary, had been gathering information for 3 weeks on Hale's behalf. The petition was signed by Hale and 2 council members. The vote was scheduled for October 20th. The proposed action was removal of any unauthorized structure within 30 days, meaning November 19th at the latest. Astrid set down the splitting maul she had been carrying and looked at Whitfield's face for the information that was not in the words. Who are the other 2 council members? Whitfield named them. One ran the dry goods supply operation that provided food to the mining camps. One owned the land adjacent to the Prickly Pear Creek frontage on the north side of town. She thought about this for 2 days. Not about whether to respond. There was no version of not responding that ended in a result she could accept, but about what responding effectively required. The meeting was public. The decision was a vote. Votes were about arithmetic, not persuasion, and the arithmetic of the council was currently 3 in favor of the petition and 2 unaligned, which meant the petition would pass unless she changed 1 vote or made the cost of passing it higher than the benefit. She walked to the mining company offices on October 17th and had conversations with 3 different operations managers about their winter storage arrangements, their equipment, maintenance costs from weather damage, and the structures their men had recently built along the creek corridor using techniques they had learned from a woman working in the Prickly Pear Canyon. She did not ask them to attend the council meeting. She told them the meeting was happening and what the proposed outcome was, and left the rest to them. On October 20th, the town hall was more full than a council meeting of this nature typically warranted. Hale had prepared his remarks carefully. He spoke for 6 minutes about public land, use community standards, the importance of ordered development, and the appropriate channels through which individuals with genuine need could seek assistance. He was a practiced speaker, and his argument had internal consistency. He did not look at Astrid, who was sitting in the 3rd row, until he sat down. She stood when Webb called her name. She had 1 piece of paper. On it were 7 names, 7 locations, and 7 descriptions of winter storage structures recently completed along the Prickly Pear Creek corridor using salvaged and foraged materials. Beside each name, she had written the mining operation or employer associated with that person. The names included men who reported to the 3 largest mining companies operating in the Helena district. Her voice was steady and unhurried, more information than argument. If the council passes this petition, all 7 of these structures will be subject to removal under its terms. That means 7 sets of equipment, supplies, and materials that are currently weatherproofed for the winter will be exposed to conditions that will result in losses. The men who own those structures work for operations that collectively employ most of the working population of this district. I wanted the council to have the full scope of what it's being asked to vote on. She sat down. She did not make eye contact with Hale. The vote was 4-2 against the petition. Webb recorded the result with the expression of a man who had understood since approximately the middle of her remarks how the arithmetic was going to resolve. One of the 2 votes in favor was Hale's proxy through the council member he had recruited. The other was the landowner with adjacent property whose interest in the outcome was personal enough that no amount of stakeholder arithmetic was going to move it. After the meeting, she walked past the row where Hale had been sitting and found it empty. She saw him through the window as she reached the door, standing with Webb in the narrow alley beside the building, his head bent slightly, his hands at his sides in the posture of a man recalibrating. She did not pause to interpret the posture. She had what she had come for. The interpretation could wait. The Strand family arrived in Helena on the 19th of October, and Astrid learned of them the same day from Whitfield, who had been hired to haul their belongings from the train station in his freight wagon. He came to find her not because he had been asked to, but because he had listened to what Eric Strand said on the wagon seat during the 30-minute drive from the depot and had understood what it meant. A speculator named Calloway out of Minneapolis had sold the Strands and 9 other families homestead claims on parcels in the Helena district land that Calloway had surveyed, documented in convincing paperwork, and had no legal right to sell because it had never been his to convey. The families had paid. The land did not exist as described. The money was gone. The families were in Montana territory in October with no resources and no recourse available fast enough to matter before winter. Whitfield's voice was flat with the particular quality of a man who had seen enough of the world's dishonesty to have stopped being surprised by it without having started finding it acceptable. Calloway, I've heard that name before in a different state in a different year. Same arrangement. Same population, Scandinavian immigrants, people who didn't know the land law well enough to know what questions to ask. He paused. The name of the Helena contact he used for the surveys. Strand mentioned it. Fellow named Niels who ran timber and land brokerage out of a cabin north of town. The silence that followed was the specific kind that contains information arriving faster than language can process it. She did not move for a long moment. Outside the dugout, the creek ran low over its stones with the patient indifference of water that had been there before the mining camps and would be there after them. The evening light came through the entrance canvas in a thin stripe across the dirt floor. She had known Niels Voss was not a man of simple convenience. She had known since the moment she watched him guide Gunner's hand across the property transfer document that he operated within systems rather than in isolation, that what he had done to her had the practiced quality of something done before refined through repetition into efficiency. What she had not known was the geographic scope of it, or that the Strand family, who had arrived in Helena with 3 children under 8 and an evangelical confidence that the New World rewarded honest labor, had been fed into the same machine by the same hand. She thanked Whitfield in a tone that did not invite further conversation, and he left with the understanding of a man who had delivered what needed delivering and recognized when the room required privacy. She sat in the dugout and let the information settle the way sediment settles in a shaken jar slowly until the layers resolve themselves into something readable. She was not going to pursue Nils through the legal system. She had no standing, no documentation of the property transfer that she had personally witnessed, no instrument that could reach what he had done to her within the existing framework of territorial law. That door was closed. But Sigrid Strand was not Astrid Voss. Sigrid Strand was the direct victim of an identifiable fraud with a named perpetrator and presumably surviving documentation of the transaction. That was a different kind of standing. That was a door that might open if the right person reached for it. She visited the Strands the following morning. Pastor Hale had put them in the church basement, a low-ceilinged room with 2 small windows at ground level, a wood stove that worked adequately in mild weather and inadequately in severe cold, and the smell of old stone and insufficient ventilation that accumulated in any below-grade space through the heating season. Eric Strand was in the single chair near the stove, wrapped in his coat. Despite the fire, his face carrying the particular grayness of a man whose body was fighting something systemic and losing. The cough she had heard before she entered the room, deep, productive, the kind that came from the chest rather than the throat. Sigrid Strand was 34 years old and 6 months pregnant, and standing at the small table cutting the children's evening meal into pieces small enough for Britta, the youngest. She looked up when Astrid entered, and her expression had the quality Astrid had seen on the faces of people who had passed a certain threshold of exhaustion, not defeat exactly, but the suspension of anything beyond immediate necessity. "How much firewood do you have?" Astrid's voice was direct, not unkind. Directness and kindness were not the same thing, but they were not mutually exclusive either. Sigrid looked at the diminished pile against the east wall. 2 weeks if we're careful. Eric can't cut more, not right now. You'll need 4 cords minimum to reach April. This stove, this space, these temperatures. She let the arithmetic stand without softening it, because the arithmetic was the point, and Sigrid was clearly a woman capable of understanding arithmetic. I need workers. I'm planning 2 more storage structures before spring, one for root vegetables, one for tools and equipment. The work is stacking and sorting, which your children can do. 1 day's work from them equals a week's worth of splits. They stack what I cut. Does that seem fair to you? The color that moved across Sigrid's face was not embarrassment exactly, though it contained something related to it, the involuntary response of a proud person being offered help through a frame that preserved the form of exchange. She understood precisely what was being offered and precisely why it was being offered in this particular form. Her voice, when she found it, was steady in the way of a person who has decided to receive something gracefully rather than protest it. That's more than fair, Mrs. Voss. Astrid left without discussing Niels or Calloway. That conversation required different ground in a different time. The 3 Strand children appeared at the alcove the following afternoon, Anna at 7, the oldest, Lars at 6, and 4-year-old Britta, who arrived holding her brother's hand with the particular grip of a child who has recently learned that the world is less predictable than previously advertised. They were Swedish-featured and serious-faced and looked at the woodshed with the focused attention of children who had been raised to pay attention to things that mattered. Astrid showed them the stacking pattern, once large logs on the base, smaller splits above, cut faces outward at a slight inward angle. She demonstrated the reason for each element, not as instruction, but as information. Here is why the angle here is why the cut face out. Then she let them work. Anna understood immediately and corrected Lars twice with the quiet authority of the oldest child who has spent her whole life slightly ahead of the others. Lars accepted the corrections without resentment because they came from someone who was right. Britta worked with a 4-year-old's version of diligence, intermittently enthusiastically, and at approximately 40% efficiency, which was more than adequate for the task, and not something Astrid had any interest in optimizing. She cut splits while they stacked. The arrangement was what she had said it was. She cut, they moved, and arranged. The difference was that she was cutting more than they were stacking, which meant the surplus was accumulating in the Strand family's share without any accounting ceremony that would have made it obvious. On the second afternoon, while the children worked at the near end of the stack and Astrid was splitting at the far end, Lars looked up from his work and asked a question that had clearly been building for some time. Why does the big wood go on the bottom? She stopped splitting. She considered for a moment whether this was a question that deserved a real answer or a simple one, and decided that the two were not mutually exclusive. Because weight wants to go down, not up. If you put the heavy thing on top, you're fighting what weight wants. If you put it on the bottom, weight is working for you instead of against you. Lars turned this over in his mind with visible effort. Like how river rocks go to the bottom and sticks float. Exactly like that. He went back to work with the expression of a child who has received information that connects to something he already suspected was true. November arrived in the same steady, lowering way it always arrived in the Helena district. Not dramatically, but irrevocably, the light changing quality and angle until the landscape looked like a photographic image of itself rather than the real thing. The temperature dropped 5 degrees from its October average and stayed there. The peaks above town acquired permanent snow covers that no longer melted back by afternoon. The creek slowed and thickened at its edges. Astrid completed the Oaks cache structure at Marysville in 9 days of work, a smaller version of the prickly pear alcove design, adapted to a site that had a less ideal natural recess, but compensated with a steeper slope angle that provided even better drainage. She worked alone because Whitfield was occupied with freight runs before the road conditions deteriorated, and the 9 days of solo work were the most purely physical days she had experienced since arriving in Montana, which was a high threshold. Oaks transferred the 5% claim stake in writing before she left the site with the specific honesty of a man who had already stated the uncertainty and saw no reason to revisit it. If the vein opens up, this is worth real money. If it doesn't, it's worth what you paid for it. He looked at her directly, which is 9 days of work that kept my equipment from rusting to nothing, which is real money regardless of what the ground does. She folded the paper and put it inside the almanac she carried. She was back at the Helena alcove by November 10th, and the town she returned to was different from the town she had left 9 days earlier in the specific way that frontier communities changed when winter became no longer theoretical. The last freight wagons before road closure were making their final runs. Wood smoke hung over the buildings in layers rather than dissipating. The conversations on the main street had acquired a clipped, purposeful quality, people moving between warmth and necessity without the margin for extended interaction that mild weather permitted. On November 12th, the winter announced itself without ambiguity. The temperature dropped to 8 degrees below zero before midnight. 6 inches of snow fell in the first 4 hours, then 8 more by dawn, then 12 more through the day, 36 inches of accumulation in 30 hours, driven by northwest wind, sustained at 55 miles per hour, with gusts above 60. The Helena Road disappeared under drifts that reached the eaves of the stage company outbuilding. The creek stopped entirely its surface, locked under ice that would not yield again until March. She was inside the dugout when it began the three-legged stove burning dry lodgepole pine that had been stored in the woodshed since October. The temperature inside the dugout sat at 48 degrees without any firelit climbing to 62, with the stove running at a moderate rate. The thermal mass of the surrounding earth performed exactly as it should, absorbing heat, slowly releasing it, slowly creating a stable thermal environment that was independent of the violent fluctuations outside. She could hear the wind in the canyon above the sound it made moving through the ponderosa timber on the ridge, a sustained roar that the dugout reduced to a background presence rather than an immediate threat. She lay listening to it on the first night and thought about the Strand family in the church basement, which had stone walls and inadequate insulation and a wood stove that Hale's congregation had last seriously tested 2 winters prior. On the second night of the storm, when the wind had not abated and the temperature had dropped another 4 degrees, Cal Merritt appeared at the dugout entrance, not something he did not, something she had ever expected him to do, which meant the reason was significant. He ducked through the canvas without ceremony and stood in the low space with the expression of a man delivering a message he had decided to deliver regardless of the weather required to deliver it. The Strand family had enough wood remaining for approximately 48 hours. Eric had not been able to leave the basement room for a week. The church stove was adequate for the basement space, but only marginally, which meant it was running continuously and consuming the supply faster than calculation had predicted. The temperature inside the basement with the stove at full capacity was 39 degrees. Astrid looked at Cal for a moment. His face was red with cold, and there was ice in his beard from the transit. He had walked from the church end of town in 60-mile-per-hour wind to tell her this, which was information about his character that she filed away separately from the immediate problem. She put on her coat and boots and picked up the lantern. The walk to the church was 3/4 of a mile through drifts that reached her waist in the worst sections. She moved with the deliberate energy-conserving pace of someone who understood that cold at this intensity punished inefficiency in proportion to the degree of inefficiency, and that the lantern served as wind indicator as much as light source. Watching how the flame behaved told her which drifts would be loosely packed and passable versus solidly wind-compressed and requiring a route around them. She passed the Voss cabin on the north side of the town. The windows showed warm lamplight. Smoke rose from the chimney in a continuous column that the wind shredded within 20 feet. She did not pause, not because she lacked feeling about it. She had never been a person who lacked feeling about things, but because feeling about it at this moment served nothing that mattered. She had somewhere to be. The church basement was cold in the specific way of spaces that are being heated at the edge of their thermal capacity. The walls ran with condensation where warm air met stone. Britta was asleep against Sigurd's side. Lars and Anna were awake, sitting with their backs against the stove in the posture of children conserving warmth through proximity. Eric was in the chair, conscious the cough audible from the entrance. Sigurd looked up. The expression on her face was not relief, it was recognition. The look of a person who had spent several hours understanding a situation was beyond their capacity to resolve, and had arrived at a kind of terrible clarity about what that meant, and who now saw that clarity interrupted. Astrid set down the lantern and spoke before Sigurd could shape any part of what she was feeling into words. I need workers. I'm planning 2 more storage structures before spring. Her voice was level, the tone of a business arrangement rather than a rescue. 1 day's work from your children equals a week's worth of splits. They stack I cut. Starting as soon as this storm breaks. Does that seem fair? The recognition in Sigurd's face shifted into something that had more components than a single word could hold: gratitude and dignity, and the specific relief of a person who has been offered a way to accept what they need without surrendering what they are. Her voice was quiet and very steady. More than fair. Outside, the wind moved through the canyon at the temperature of something that had no interest in human survival or human ingenuity or the particular arrangements that people made with each other to hold the cold back for one more night. It was simply weather. It had always been simply weather. The difference between the people who survived it and the people who did not had never been a matter of deserving. Over the next 3 weeks, the Strand children came to the alcove every afternoon after the storm cleared. They stacked what she cut. The stack in the church basement grew in increments that were invisible from day to day, but unmistakable from week to week. Britta's efficiency improved substantially by the second week, having understood through observation that the work had a logic and that the logic could be learned. Lars asked questions every day, not the distracted questions of a bored child, but the focused questions of a child building a model of how things worked. Anna answered half of them before Astrid could, which was accurate enough that Astrid stopped feeling the need to correct. She taught them to read the weather in the cloud formations above the Elkhorn Range, the specific shapes that preceded temperature drops versus the shapes that preceded precipitation. The difference in the southwest sky between a storm system approaching and a system passing. She taught them how to identify lodgepole pine by its bark pattern at 50 yards and why its straight grain made it preferable for splitting and why green wood burned smoky where seasoned wood burned clean. These were not lessons in the school subject sense. They were operational knowledge, the kind that kept you alive in a place that was indifferent to your survival. By Christmas, the Strand family's share of the wood stack represented enough fuel to carry them to April if the winter followed the almanac. If the winter exceeded the almanac, as Montana winters sometimes chose to do, they would need more. But Astrid had already calculated that contingency and had cut and stacked the surplus 3 weeks earlier. January 8, 1877, arrived the way the worst days arrived in Montana, quietly without announcement, as though the weather understood that drama was unnecessary when the facts were sufficient on their own. Eric Strand died at 3 in the morning. Astrid knew before Cal Merritt reached her dugout because she had been awake since 2, lying in the particular stillness that precedes news the body somehow receives before the mind, listening to the canyon, hold its cold breath. When she heard Cal's boots on the frozen ground outside, she was already sitting up, already reaching for her coat. He did not say anything when she opened the canvas. His face said it. She walked to the church with him through a dark that was absolute: no moon, no stars visible through the cloud cover, the temperature sitting at 12 below zero with the windless quality of deep cold that had fully settled rather than arrived. The lantern threw a circle of amber that made the darkness outside it more complete rather than less. She had made this walk twice before in worse weather. Her feet knew the ground now, the particular give of the frozen soil at the creek crossing the slight uphill grade that began at the lumber staging area and carried all the way to the church's north entrance. The basement room was warmer than it had been in November, Not because the stove was running harder, but because the wood supply was adequate now and had been adequate for 6 weeks, which meant the stove could run at proper temperature rather than being rationed. Eric Strand lay on the narrow cot against the east wall with his hands folded and his face carrying the expression that people's faces settled into after the body's work was finished. Not peaceful exactly, but resolved, the look of something that had reached its conclusion. Sigrid was sitting on the edge of the cot holding Eric's left hand in both of hers. The three children were asleep in the far corner, huddled under the blankets in the specific arrangement they had established weeks ago for maximum shared warmth, Anna on the outside with her back to the room, Britta in the middle, Lars against the wall. They had slept through it. Sigrid had let them sleep. This was the kind of decision that defined a person, the choice to protect the ones you could protect, for as long as you could protect them, even when the thing you were protecting them from had already happened. Astrid sat down beside Sigrid without speaking. She did not put her arm around her or take her hand or do any of the things that made the person doing them feel useful while contributing nothing material to the person receiving them. She simply sat there in the cold basement room with its wood smoke smell and its condensation-streaked stone walls as a physical presence that said, "You are not alone in this room." That was what she had to offer at 3 in the morning, and it was what was needed, and she did not inflate it into something larger. After a while, Sigrid's voice came low and flat. "He knew he was sick when we left Minnesota. He didn't tell me how sick." Astrid did not fill the silence that followed with reassurance or interpretation. She let it stand as what it was, the specific silence of a person processing a betrayal that had also been an act of love, trying to hold both things simultaneously in a mind that was exhausted beyond the capacity for that kind of complexity. Sigrid's grip on Eric's hand tightened once briefly and then released. "He wanted to give us something, a start, a piece of land." Her voice carried neither anger nor exculpation. It carried the flat, clarified quality of a person who had arrived at understanding after the point where understanding could change anything. Calloway gave him that, or something that looked enough like it. The name sat between them in the cold air. Astrid had been carrying the information about Calloway and Niels for 6 weeks, waiting for the right ground and the right time. She had calculated, both with the same patience she applied to other structural problems, you do not close a joint until the material is ready, and you know the material is ready when it stops moving. Sigrid was not yet at the point of stillness that what Astrid had to tell her required. She was still in the moving stage, the acute grief, the immediate reckoning, the first night. The conversation had to wait until Sigrid had passed through enough of it to use information rather than be overwhelmed by it. The burial happened 3 days later, on a Tuesday, the ground prepared by 2 days of fire warming the earth above the frost line. Cal Merritt came with a shovel and did not speak. Whitfield came and did not speak either, because they were both men who expressed things through presence and physical labor rather than language, which in this instance was the more useful form of expression available. Pastor Hale performed the service because it was his obligation to perform it, and because whatever his personal feelings about the family or about Astrid, who stood at the graveside, the pastoral duty was a category he had never compromised and would not start compromising now. She gave him credit for that privately and without softening anything else. Anna held Britta's hand throughout the service. Lars held Anna's. The three of them stood at the graveside in their inadequate winter coats, with the specific stoicism of children who have learned faster than any child should have to learn it, that the world does not pause for grief. 4 days after the burial, when Sigrid had passed through the acute phase and the children had returned to their afternoon work routine at the woodshed, Astrid sat down with her in the basement room with 2 cups of coffee from the church kitchen, hot black, the particular comfort of something warm, in a hand that has been cold for too long, and told her what she knew. She began with Niels and the property transfer because Sigrid needed to understand the shape of the system before the specific details of Calloway made sense within it. She described what she had witnessed at Gunnar's bedside without embellishment or emotional editorializing. The paper, the guided hand, the legal result because the facts were damning enough on their own, and because Sigrid was a person who deserved accurate information rather than an arranged version of it. Then she told her what Whitfield had established about Calloway's pattern, the connection between Calloway's operations and Nils Voss's land brokerage, and what that connection implied about the 9 other families who had lost money on fraudulent Helena District claims. She finished with the assessment that mattered. I have no legal standing against Nils for what he did to me. The transfer was witnessed and recorded, and I was not present at the signing in any official capacity. But you are a direct victim of an identifiable fraud with a named perpetrator and a paper trail that presumably still exists in Minneapolis and in the land office records. That gives you standing that I don't have. Sigrid's hands had been still around her coffee cup throughout. Her face had moved through several things. Recognition, anger, the cold settling of something that had been formless, dread becoming named and therefore manageable, and arrived somewhere that was neither calm nor distressed, but simply clear. Focus the way a lens focuses when you find the right distance. I'm going to need a lawyer, she said. There's a firm in Minneapolis. Lundgren and Carter, they specialize in land fraud cases in the immigrant communities. Their address is in the legal notices of the St. Paul Pioneer Press. Astrid had located this information 3 weeks earlier through the church's copy of the newspaper that Hale kept for the congregation's use. She had written the address on a folded piece of paper that she now set on the table between them. I cannot bring this case. You can. You and the other families who were defrauded, I can tell you of at least 4 others in this district alone. Sigrid looked at the paper and then at Astrid and then at the paper again. There was a long moment in which the weight of what was being offered, not just information, but the specific shape of a path forward in a situation that had appeared to have no forward in it, was visibly passing through her. Her voice when it came was quiet and entirely without performance. Why are you doing this? It was a genuine question, not a suspicious one. It deserved a genuine answer. Astrid looked at the coffee cup in her own hands for a moment. Because Nils Voss moved through the world treating people as materials to be used when useful and discarded when not. The only thing that changes that particular arithmetic is consequence. I can't deliver consequence to him directly. But you can, and the other families can, and the outcome is the same regardless of who delivers it. Sigrid picked up the paper and folded it into her coat pocket with the deliberate motion of someone securing something valuable. She did not say anything more about gratitude or obligation, which was the correct response, and told Astrid something important about who Sigrid Strand was. Underneath the exhaustion and the grief, a person who received practical things practically, who understood that the best acknowledgement of useful help was using it. The letter to Lundgren and Carter went out with the first mail freight of February. Over the following 3 weeks, Sigrid visited 4 other families from the defrauded group who had remained in the Helena district rather than returning east, gathering signed statements about the Calloway transactions with the methodical persistence of a woman who had nothing left to lose and therefore could not be discouraged by ordinary friction. She coordinated through the Lutheran Church's communication network, a fact that contained its own irony, given Hale's role as the congregation's authority, though Hale appeared either unaware of or deliberately neutral toward the correspondence passing through his church's facilities. By April, the U.S. Land Office in Helena had opened a formal inquiry into Calloway's transaction records. By the following autumn, Calloway had been indicted on 12 counts of land fraud in federal territorial court. The case against him moved through the legal system with the soul-grinding inevitability of institutional machinery applied to a clear evidentiary record. Nils Voss lost his territorial land brokerage license in the spring of 1877, 2 months before the Calloway indictment was filed in a proceeding that was technically separate from the fraud case, but drew on the same documentation. He retained the Voss property, the cabin, the land, the legal record of Gunner's final signature, because none of that had been challenged in a forum with the authority to challenge it, and because Astrid had never expected otherwise. What he lost was the capacity to operate the system that had made him a predator rather than merely an opportunist. That was not justice in its full meaning. It was the partial, imperfect, practically available version of justice that actual circumstances permit rather than the complete version that circumstances only occasionally allow. Astrid received the news of Niels's license revocation on a Tuesday morning from Cal Merritt, who had heard it from Webb, who had processed the paperwork. She was working at the edge of her homestead claim when Cal told her digging post holes for a fence line, the kind of physical work that focused the body and freed the mind. She listened to the information straightened from the post hole and went back to digging. Cal watched her for a moment and then apparently decided that a woman returning to fence post work after hearing news like that had communicated something through the action itself, and he left without requiring a verbal response. The homestead claim had come through in March, processed by the land office under the provisions of the 1862 Homestead Act, filed with Cal's assistance on the paperwork in his surveyor's notation of the claim boundaries. The filing fee had been $14 borrowed from Whitfield against payment in instruction repaid within 6 weeks, when she taught 3 different homesteading families the alcove structure method, and they paid in labor and materials that freed her cash for the debt. The day the land office clerk handed her the filed copy of the claim document, she stood at the counter and read her name in the official printed line, Astrid Voss claimant. Not wife of, not widow of, not dependent of, or charity of, or arrangement of. Claimant, a person with legal standing to a piece of American ground. She walked home with the document inside the almanac between its cover and its first page, where it would be protected from moisture and handling. She did not tell anyone she had received it. The fact of it was sufficient. The spring thaw arrived in mid-March with the violent enthusiasm that Montana springs characteristically applied, the creek rising from nothing to dangerous in 48 hours, the roads becoming impassable in ways that were qualitatively different from their winter impassability, the landscape undergoing a kind of structural reorganization that affected everything from trail grades to the stability of dugout roofs under the weight of saturating soil. She had engineered the dugout drainage with enough slope and channel to handle the melt runoff, and it performed as intended, but she spent 3 days of the thaw period making continuous small adjustments to keep the drainage paths clear as debris accumulated in them. The woodshed required nothing from her. The thaw produced conditions specifically hostile to the traditional milled lumber woodshed design ground. Saturation wicketed up through floorboards. Roof expansion created gap cycling that let meltwater in the temperature cycling of freeze. Thaw-freeze applied to rigid lumber joints produced exactly the kind of slow structural degradation that required regular maintenance to manage. She heard about 3 woodsheds on Helena's north side that had significant damage from the spring conditions, warped floorboards too, with roof gaps that had let in substantial water, one whose wallboards had bowed enough to require re-nailing before the following winter. The prickly pear alcove structure shed the thaw the same way it had shed the winter storms. The curved roof channeled meltwater to both sides. The clay composite walls absorbed and released moisture without failing at any joint. The earth-sheltered back wall remained thermally stable through the temperature cycling because its mass was too large to respond quickly to surface temperature changes. She found when she opened the burlap door in mid-March and did a full inspection that the remaining wood inside was dry unchanged exactly as she had left it in January. 1 full cord of split lodgepole remained in the stack. She had built for 4 and used 3. In a winter the almanac described as the coldest in a decade, the margin was precision, not luck, not excess, but calculation that had held under every condition the season could produce. She walked back to the dugout and began thinking about what to build next. The conversation with Pastor Hale happened in late April on a morning when the canyon was showing its first genuine spring color cottonwood leaf. Out the pale yellow-green that preceded full foliage, the kind of color that looks tentative until you understand it as the leading edge of something that cannot be stopped. She was working at the alcove doing the spring inspection and adding a finishing coat of clay to two surface areas where the winter's freeze-thaw cycling had opened shallow cracks in the exterior wall, exactly as she had anticipated, exactly the scale she had prepared for. She heard him coming before she saw him because Hale moved with the deliberate, measured pace of a man who was not inclined to arrive casually at any destination. He stopped at the edge of the alcove and looked at what she was doing: the clay trowel, the mixing bucket, the two patched areas on the east wall, and his expression contained something that was not its usual composition. "There is a family in my congregation," he said. "The Hoffmans, he's the blacksmith on the commercial street. They need storage for his tools and materials through the winter. They don't have the means for a commercial structure." He paused with the specific quality of a man who has prepared more words and is deciding whether to use them. "I understand you've been teaching the construction method to others." She continued working the clay into the wall surface. "I have. Would you be willing to work with them?" She did not make him say anything further about what had passed between them in October, about the petition, about the ways in which his judgment of her and her work had been tested against the winter and found insufficient. He was not a man who would have come to her with this request if he had not already had that internal reckoning, and extracting a verbal acknowledgement of it would have served her satisfaction at the cost of his capacity to receive what she was teaching. She had no interest in that trade. "Send them to me," she said, "next week when the ground is workable." He stood there for a moment longer, and she looked up from the wall, and what passed between them in the silence was not reconciliation. Their views of the world were still sufficiently different that reconciliation would have been a false name for it, but something that two people can reach across genuine difference when both of them have been made honest by a winter that did not care about either of their opinions. She went back to the clay work. He left the way he had come with the same measured pace, but something had shifted in the weight of it. The Hoffmans came the following Tuesday. The blacksmith Johann, a large, quiet man whose hands showed the specific damage of decades of forge work, and his wife Marta, who was the more immediately perceptive of the two, and who looked at the alcove structure with the focused attention of someone understanding a system rather than observing a surface. Astrid walked them through the principles the same way she walked everyone through them, not as instruction, but as information. Here it is why the curve here is why the clay here is, how the material behaves under the conditions it will encounter. She was demonstrating the willow-bending technique, the grip, the arc, the point at which you could feel the wood accepting rather than resisting the imposed curve when she became aware that Hale was standing at the edge of the clearing. Not close, not participating. Just standing, watching the demonstration with the particular stillness of a man learning something through observation that he was not ready to learn through direct engagement. She did not acknowledge him. She finished the demonstration for the Hoffmans and moved to the next element of the teaching. But she understood what his presence meant, not conversion, not change of fundamental worldview, but the specific pragmatism of a man who had watched a method survive a winter that broke other methods and had arrived through the evidence at the conclusion that the method was worth knowing. That was the only conversion she had ever been interested in producing. The teaching work expanded through the spring and summer of 1877 in the organic way that useful knowledge expands in closed communities, not through advertising or advocacy, but through the visible fact of functioning results. Families who had built the alcove structure through the winter referred their neighbors. Whitfield sent people from the mining camps. Cal Merritt mentioned her name to every homesteader he encountered on survey work, not as a recommendation in any formal sense, but as a piece of practical information. If you need winter storage and you don't have $35 for a commercial woodshed, there's a woman on Prickly Pear Creek who can show you something better. She charged based on capacity. From people who had cash, she accepted cash. From people who had food or materials, she accepted food or materials. From people who had neither, she accepted the promise to teach someone else the method when the opportunity arose, which was a currency that had no face value, but compounded in ways that cash did not. By midsummer, she had worked with 23 families and had been paid in a combination of coin-dried goods, lumber for her expanding homestead, and the accumulated social knowledge of being a person in a community who was known to solve problems that resisted conventional solutions. Sigrid Strand stayed in Helena. This was the outcome that had not been predetermined. She had the option after the land office inquiry opened, and the pressure on Callaway's operation began to generate some partial financial recovery for the defrauded families to take the children back to Minnesota, where her own family was located. She chose not to. She chose Helena, which at first appeared to be a choice of inertia, but revealed itself over the following months as something more deliberate. A woman who had arrived in a place under terrible circumstances and had found in the circumstances themselves a version of herself she had not known before and was not ready to leave behind. She found work through the church network, teaching the older children of the congregation who could not attend the formal school reading arithmetic, the basics of written correspondence. It was not the life she and Eric had planned when they left Minnesota. It was a different life assembled from what the winter had left rather than what the summer had promised. She carried it without apology. The child Sigrid had been carrying through that winter was born in February, delivered in the church basement by the same doctor who had attended 3 births in the Helena district that month, in a room that was heated by wood the Strand children had stacked. It was a girl. Sigrid named her Astrid. She came to tell her the name in person, walking to the alcove on a February afternoon with the baby wrapped against her chest, the cold already returning, but the light beginning its almost imperceptible lengthening towards spring. She did not make a ceremony of it. She said, "I named her Astrid. I want her to grow up knowing the name of the woman who showed this family that there was always something to work with even when it looked like there was nothing." The woman who received this stood very still for a moment, looking at the child's face in its wrapping, the unfocused, ancient-looking attention of a newborn, encountering everything for the first time. She had buried 2 children years ago in a different country, in a life that this life had been built on top of. She did not say anything about that. She said she has her father's hands, which was true in the finger as long and blunt-tipped as Eric's had been, and which was its own kind of honoring. The Marysville situation resolved itself in March of 1878, which was 15 months after Wade Oakes had transferred the 5% stake to Astrid in lieu of cash payment for the equipment cash structure. She had not thought about the stake in any active way during those 15 months. It sat in the almanac beside the homestead claim document as a contingent fact present, but not operational, the way unplanted seeds are present in a packet without being a garden. Whitfield told her. He had heard it at the mining camp mess 3 days after the vein opened, because the vein opening was the kind of news that moved through the mining district, the way important weather moved through faster than anyone could actually travel, arriving at every point simultaneously through some atmospheric property of human attention. The Marysville vein had struck a horizontal shelf of native silver at a depth of 412 feet extending northeast along the fault at a width and grade that the assay reports described in numbers. Whitfield repeated from memory because they were the kind of numbers that lodged themselves without effort. She went to see Oakes at the Marysville camp the following week. He was a man whose fundamental nature had not changed with the change in his circumstances. Still compact, still methodical, still the specific honesty of a man who had told her the uncertainty up front and would not now pretend the outcome was something other than what it was. He looked at her across the camp table with the expression of a man who was genuinely glad the person opposite him was going to receive what they were about to receive. 5% of current valuation, he said, plus 5% of revenue going forward until you choose to sell the stake. He named the current valuation figure. She looked at him for a moment with the steady expression of a person receiving information they need to process before responding to. The figure was enough to buy land. Not a small parcel, but a substantial one. The kind of acreage that in Montana Territory in 1878 represented serious ownership rather than survival-scale holding. It was enough to build a permanent house to establish for the first time in her adult life a position that was not contingent on weather or time or the decisions of men who had authority over her circumstances. She had not expected this when she accepted the stake. She had accepted it because Oaks had been honest about its uncertainty and because work fairly done deserved payment, fairly received, and the only payment available was a contingent asset. The outcome was not the product of calculation. It was the product of the accumulated decisions she had made since September 17th, 1876, to work with what was available rather than mourn what was absent, to build relationships through competence rather than dependency, to accept payment in whatever honest form it was offered. The stake had been one transaction in a long series. The silver had transformed it retroactively into the transaction that changed the arithmetic of everything. She thanked Oaks in the same even tone she used for practical exchanges and rode back to Helena in the cold March afternoon with the revised numbers in her head, calculating what they made possible, which was a different kind of calculation than she had made for the previous 18 months. The previous calculations had all been about minimum sufficient. This one was about what she would choose if the minimum was no longer the constraint. She chose land, 160 acres first, along a drainage northeast of Helena, where the soil was good and the water reliable and the elevation protected the growing season without eliminating it. Then additional parcels over the following 2 years as the Marysville revenue continued and the teaching work produced its own accumulating returns. The house she built on the first parcel in the summer of 1878 was not extravagant. It was well-made, properly jointed, built with materials purchased rather than foraged, though she incorporated several of the thermal mass principles from the dugout into its design, which produced a house that was notably warmer in winter than comparable structures in the district, and which the builder she hired noted with professional admiration was going to hold its integrity for a generation without major maintenance. The alcove structure at Prickly Pear Creek remained standing after she moved to the new property. Several families were using the canyon corridor for their own winter storage in variants of the original design, which gave her a practical interest in keeping the original visible as a reference. She visited it occasionally in the first years after the move, with the eye of a builder checking a structure she had made against the passage of time. What she found on each visit was that it was holding. The willow framework had fully lignified. The living wood had completed its transition to something structurally closer to finished timber than to the green saplings she had bent in September of 1876. Rigid in the curve she had imposed, locked into the form it had accepted. The clay composite had sealed itself through successive summer and winter cycles into a surface that was harder than it had been when fresh. The bark tiles had weathered to a gray silver that made them nearly invisible against the hillside at anything beyond 50 yards. By 1879, she had worked with 37 families. By 1880, the census taker who came to her door recorded her occupation as she gave it teacher of practical building techniques. He wrote it down without apparent surprise, which said something about what Helena had become in the 4 years since the winter that had tested everyone who had been in it. The design variations that had spread through the district had by this point produced enough examples that someone with the right frame of reference could trace the common ancestry in each one: the arch, the earth shelter, the curved surface that shed load rather than resisting it, while recognizing that each builder had adapted the original principles to their specific site, their specific available materials, their specific requirements. A structure in the Marysville district built by a family who had learned the method third hand had incorporated a stone foundation course under the clay wall base that she had never specified, but that was a perfectly logical extension of the thermal mass principle to a site with accessible fieldstone. She saw it on a visit to the camp and recognized in it the specific creativity of a good solution understood deeply enough to be improved. This was the thing she had not entirely anticipated when she built the first structure, from necessity on September 17th, 1876, that a method taught freely without documentation or certification or institutional authority would generate not copies but iterations, each one carrying the essential structure of the original and adding something specific to its context. The design was not replicating. It was evolving the way useful knowledge evolved when it was genuinely useful, not because anyone was directing it, but because the problems it solved were real and the people solving them were paying attention. By 1880, the design had moved beyond the Helena district. Variants of it appeared in the mining camps of Wyoming Territory, in the homestead quarters of Dakota, in the mountain settlements of Colorado, adapted to local ground and local material, in local winter, each iteration carrying the essential geometry forward, the arch, the earth shelter, the curve that worked with load rather than resisting it. No one called it Astrid's design. The community had given it a neutral name, the Hill Shelter, which was accurate and impersonal, and said nothing about who had worked it out on a September morning with $7 and a deadline. That was how useful knowledge traveled in that era, and probably in every era. Not attached to a name, not certified or documented or institutionally endorsed. Simply present in the hands of people who had learned it, moving outward through the ordinary channels of frontier communication, word-of-mouth observation, the practical referral of one neighbor to another. The knowledge outlasted the person who had remembered it at the right moment, which was the best thing knowledge could do. Sigrid Strand left Helena in 1883 when her oldest daughter, Anna, married a rancher from the Judith Basin, and Sigrid went with them to help with the establishment of the new household, and then remained as people remain in places where they are needed. They corresponded twice yearly with a regularity that was itself a kind of structure. Letters that reported on children and weather and the particular texture of life in their respective sections of the territory, letters that never discussed what the winter of 1876 had been, or what it had made either of them, because neither of them needed to discuss it. It was present in everything they had built, since which was a more durable record than words. James Whitfield died in 1891, which Astrid felt as a specific subtraction from the sum of the world, rather than merely an absence, because he had been the kind of person whose presence was not neutral, who made the ground he stood on a slightly more workable place. She attended the burial and stood at it the way she had stood at Eric Strand's burial 14 years before present, grounded, offering what presence could offer and not inflating it into something it was not. Young Astrid Strand, the February child, the one name for her, grew up in the Judith Basin, went east for 3 years of schooling, and returned to Montana to work in land title verification at the district land office in Great Falls. She wrote occasionally letters that had the clear-eyed directness of a person who had been taught somewhere early to pay attention to what was actually in front of her, rather than what she hoped or feared was there. Astrid Voss died in October of 1903 at 68 in the house on the original homestead claim, which was by then surrounded by 320 acres of land that she owned without encumbrance and had worked without asking permission of anyone. The Helena Independent published a notice that described her contributions to practical frontier architecture and noted that she had taught by various estimates more than 40 families the value of adapting available materials to local conditions. It was a decent notice for a woman of that era and that region, which was to say, it captured the outline of what she had done without touching the interior of it. What the notice could not contain was a specific weight of what September 17th, 1876 had been. 2 flour sacks, a splitting maul, $7 distributed between a coat pocket and a boot. The brother-in-law standing in the doorframe with his weight on his back heel and his face arranged into the careful neutrality of a man who had already decided that her options were limited to the ones he was offering. She had walked south from that doorframe rather than north because north was what he expected, and she had spent the rest of her life building in the direction that the available material suggested rather than the direction that convention specified. The knowledge had been in her hands since childhood, planted there by a father who burned charcoal in a Swedish forest, and who understood that the most durable things were not the ones built from the most expensive materials, but the ones built in alignment with the forces already present, the curve of the land, the behavior of living wood, the way thermal mass worked with cold rather than against it. She had not invented any of this. She had remembered it at the right moment in the right place, when remembering it was the difference between survival and its absence. And then she had taught it to anyone who came to learn, because knowledge that stays in one set of hands is not knowledge, it is a secret, and secrets serve the person keeping them rather than the problem requiring them. 9 years after her death in August of 1912, a fire started northeast of Prickly Pear Canyon in the timber on the upper ridges and moved with the speed that late summer fires moved in the Montana mountains faster than any response available, burning through the canyon corridor in a single afternoon, taking the cottonwoods along the creek bank. The ponderosa stands on the ridges, the accumulated deadfall of decades along the canyon floor. The alcove structure went with it, reduced to the rock face itself and the anchor holes where the stakes had been driven into stone in September of 1876, 2 rows of small depressions that would remain for another century at least. If you knew what they were the record of a specific geometry, 11 feet across, 16 inches between each arch, the exact spacing of a solution worked out under pressure by a person who could not afford to be wrong and therefore paid the quality of attention that makes being wrong less likely. The fire could take the wood and the clay and the bark. It could not take the geometry. That had already left, carried in the hands of the people who had learned it, distributed across 3 territories and still moving outward. She had been in the end a person who paid attention to what was already there and used it honestly. In conditions where that quality was the difference between surviving and not, it turned out to be enough. It turned out, in fact, to be everything.